Hi folks, my name is Matthias. I'm a former engineer, multiple times founder, former CEO and CTO. But these days, I'm mostly helping other founders and executives as a coach at said company. I've also been working on a book to help other founders and executives and anyone in management really to build effective organizations. The book is meant as a guide through challenging yet perpetually recurring situations you're facing when building and scaling organizations. A lot of what I'm talking about today also ties back into the book. And today, I want to talk about decision making. As a founder, CEO, and CTO, I've had to make a ton of decisions, whether I actually liked it or not. It seemed like every little thing came onto my desk to make a decision on. And as senior leaders, executives, managers, product managers, tech leads, all these small and seemingly random decisions and problems take up a lot of energy and time, leaving little space for you to think about the bigger picture, the why and the what of decision making, if you will. That's what my talk is about. Becoming better at making decisions by thinking not just about the decisions themselves. I'm going to talk about ways to make good decisions within a reasonable amount of time without expending a lot of time and energy. So let's get started. First off, I want to take you back in time a bit and talk about how humankind used to make decisions not too long ago. It is July 13th, 1824. We're in an unidentified war where France is involved. A French sergeant, maybe one of those pictured here, was wounded in the chest during combat so badly that he fainted from blood loss within minutes. He was brought in for treatment straight away. And at the local hospital, doctors immediately drew 570 milliliters of blood to prevent inflammation of the wound. Then they drew 680 milliliters more the following night and 280 milliliters more the next morning. Until the evening, after the day he got wounded, blood was drawn 5 more times, an additional 1,300 milliliters. Despite all the blood drawn, the wound got inflamed anyway, extending the sergeant's stay at the hospital by a month. I'm talking here about the ancient healing technique of bloodletting, the practice of drawing blood with the goal of healing a patient from any ailment or preventing a sickness altogether. Depending on where the patient was assumed to be sick, blood would be drawn close to that area. It was assumed back then that blood would only flow in one direction in the body, and that if you let it out, the bad blood would be removed. Bloodletting as a healing practice goes back to at least 500 before the Common Era, or BC in short, some 2,500 years. Around the same time the Acropolis was built, actually, when it was used here in Greece, as shown in this vase. And some accounts even point to use in ancient Egypt, 2000 to about 1500 before the Common Era, spanning a total of 4,000 years of bloodletting being in active use. Interestingly, different cultures across the continents have, over time, come up with bloodletting as a healing technique, independent of each other. So it's not an isolated phenomenon. The West, in particular, developed a fascination with it, starting around the 1500s, where barbers did the gory work in their shops. The now iconic barber pole still represents the red blood drawn and the white bandages used to dress up the resulting wounds back then. I'll tell you right now, you're not going to look at this thing the same way you did so far. That's what my friends have been telling me after I told them this story. The use of leeches was also very popular, attaching them right around the edges of the wound, where supposedly they'd be of the greatest help. And here's a fun fact. In the 1830s, France imported about 40 million leeches per year for the purpose of bloodletting. Back in 1824, our sergeant eventually recovered after 2.5 months, and his doctor concluded, by the large quantity of blood lost, 4.8 liters, and the application of leeches, drawing another 1.1 liters, the life of the patient was preserved. That's a total of 5.9 liters of blood drawn over the course of just a few weeks. I'm not sure, if this is something you keep track of or score of or are curious about, but the body of an average built male only contains about 5.7 liters of blood. In the spirit of this talk, which is about decision-making after all, let's imagine what that process looked like. The process around bloodletting looked like more in a formal way, as a framework, if you will. It's pretty simple to execute for any doctor or barber. And there's a party at the end if the patient is actually cured. And of course, the doctor gets paid. We can expand on this a little bit and also include the principles and the data feeding into the process. In this case, we have false assumptions about the body, how blood is actually circulating or flowing in the body, and a 66% survival rate of bloodlet patients serving as our guiding principles. You can even pretend to build in a feedback loop, like doing regular retrospective on this process, where you rely on past data and where a patient's death can only mean that you didn't draw enough blood and that you should have drawn more. That way you can pretend to be scientific and that you're learning from past experiences. But no matter how hard you try, you can't get around the fact that bloodletting is a superstition, which is defined as a belief, practice, or rite irrationally maintained by ignorance of the laws of nature or by faith in magic or chance. Not my definition, Wordnik's definition. In superstitions, people make decisions guided by assumptions that turn out to not be true. In this case, it's the laws of nature that people simply didn't know existed. They just didn't know how the body works. So things were left up to chance. And that only started changing in the later part of the 1800s. In particular, thanks to Dr. John Hughes Bennett of Edinburgh, who in the 1830s compared a group of patients who've been bloodlet to treat pneumonia with a group healed using restorative methods, meaning they just let the sickness run its course without any intervention. 33% in the group of bloodlet patients died. Only 3% in the restorative group. That's 10 times more death than doing nothing at all. He made a very convincing argument with the data, but had to go up against the firm beliefs and the emotional attachment of other doctors to the practice of bloodletting. Their very livelihood was supported by using bloodletting as a healing method. And as a doctor back then, you couldn't charge anything for doing nothing, but you could charge something for doing bloodletting. That's a thing. In the longer term, though, the laws of nature and empirical data to draw a logical connection prevailed. Reason prevailed. Fewer and fewer things in medicine were left up to chance from then on. So, allow me to fast forward a couple of years, where we suddenly find ourselves in the early 2000s. I was still early in my career, and my own decision-making back then would still leave a lot to be desired. I was working my way through the early Berlin tech startup scene as a freelancer, mostly driven by what I found interesting and by not sticking around for too long on things that I really didn't really enjoy doing. I had a drive to do my own thing for most of my life, and so in 2009, I joined a group of folks that I didn't know too well to start a business together. Just sounded fun and interesting, like most other things that I got drawn to. We managed to bootstrap this venture into a successful business, but when it came to conflict, like allocating who's getting what number of shares, my instinct was to flee. And when we couldn't figure this out, I decided to leave the company almost overnight. And that decision to leave was made on a whim, just like the decision to join in the first place. But it wasn't just running away from conflict. It was also about the commitment implied in the conversation around shares that had me turn away, that I was struggling with. I left a lot of things to chance that way. And if you look at this graph and compare it to the one from bloodletting earlier, my decision-making still looked a lot like people, the decision-making people used to do bloodletting in the past. And so I only recently really understood what drove my decision-making back then, and also the avoidance of difficult conversation still early in my career. My parents mostly left me to myself in my childhood and in my youth. That's no shade on them. They fed me, they put a roof over my head, and they provided for me. But I also never really faced a ton of conflict at home, nor a good talking to, especially in my teenage and adolescence years, which I can tell you would have been very appropriate given some of the report cards that I brought home. All that led me to have a very strong urge for independence, for being in control of my life and for what I do, which did make it difficult in situations where you're starting something with other people, where there's always an implied commitment to each other. The same response to flee again kicked in on another much more recent conversation around shares. Though this time I finally understood independence's influence. Now being aware of it as a guiding principle in my decision-making, I could start questioning whether that's what I want to keep doing, that's what I want to keep driving my decisions. And I came to the conclusion that it no longer served me. I wanted to make better and more conscious decisions. And so I came to learn that having explicit guiding principles or values, as has come up quite a few times today already, was a much better way to not leave decisions up to chance, especially when these guiding principles or values describe the reality as is and not as I would wish it to be, like with a superstition or with bloodletting again. This graph still looks a little bit like a superstition, but if you think about it, a superstition really was just a decision-making process that was using guiding principles that were misguided. And here is my current list of guiding principles or values, and I encourage you to build your own to make your decision-making easier. Or you can steal these and start there. You will notice that independence isn't in there anymore. It didn't serve me well in my past decision-making, and so I made a conscious choice not to let it influence me any further. Instead, I made it about the things I control, which is also the core message in my coaching practice. How did I get to these? I thought about which behaviors are the most helpful to me in my leadership, and which of these behaviors I also want to see in the people working with me. There are also aspirational behaviors like curiosity over avoidance, which ties back into my tendency to flee from conflict. Whenever I get that feeling again, I remind myself to be curious where the discomfort comes from and to run towards the discomfort instead of away from it. So, bloodletting and other superstitions, Carlos mentioned reorgs earlier today, one of the great corporate superstitions that exists. They were some of the earliest decision-making frameworks used by humans. Superstitions, bloodletting, and modern days it's reorgs. Only that they were based on false assumptions. Faulty guiding principles that didn't serve decision-making well, just like independence did for me, only with much more dire consequences. Today, we have access to a wide library of frameworks that you can use in our daily work that are grounded in reality. They have been tested and proven time and time again with sufficient data to give them merit. And I want to talk about one of them here. But to get there, I want to talk about branches. It's an engineering conference, and engineering and product conference after all. During my first month as a newly minted CTO, I had instated a new decision-making process for the engineering organization. Someone on the team had put together a long proposal that outlined a new release process and branching strategy. According to the decision-making process that we had, that I instated, the proposal was to be shared for feedback before it could be decided. The proposal was written by a senior and well-respected engineer with tenure at the company. And within a few days, a lot of thumbs-up emojis had accumulated in the document, signaling approval from a broad group of engineers. But behind closed doors, 2 other senior engineers with tenure approached me and voiced their concerns about the proposal. They didn't agree with the approach, but hesitated to voice their dissent in public. In their own words, they didn't want to rock the boat. The engineer who'd written the proposal, however, had no idea that there was disagreement. There were plenty of positive indicators and thumbs ups in the document that showed otherwise. So there were only really two possible things that could happen here. Either the two folks with concerns could change their approach and speak up, or they would watch the proposal be finalized and implemented, being unhappy with the decision for a month or years, maybe even leaving the company because of it. But speaking up would mean that they would stand out as dissenters. They'd be the ones disagreeing where everybody else seemed to agree. And meanwhile, nobody in the group really knew what everyone else was thinking. Thumbs up feedback isn't very meaningful, so even the author didn't know whether anyone had really read and processed the branching proposal, or whether they just went along with everybody else, assuming that they had read it and thought it was fine. With the way our process worked, it would be finalized eventually if there was no further feedback indicating otherwise, and the entire team would be stuck with it despite the concerns. Once again, there was a risk of leaving things up to chance. While I also have opinions about branching strategies, and I'm sure some folks here do too, I wanted to focus on the bigger picture, on the hesitation to voice feedback while letting a potentially dangerous decision for the organization play out. The system behind the system, if you will. And there's a neat framework that's helpful in understanding group dynamics when it feels like people are stuck. It stems from game theory and is called the Nash equilibrium, named after the mathematician John Nash. And in a Nash equilibrium, every person in a group makes the best decision for herself based on what she thinks the others will do. So in our example, the proposer really wanted the proposal to go through, thought it was a great idea, and saw lots of indicators from the team that he was right. Granted, he'd not gotten any written feedback, only thumbs up emojis, but in this strange new world, a thumbs up emoji says more than 1,000 words. The folks who provided the feedback didn't have much to worry about either. As far as they were concerned, they had followed the process and they had done their part. But the two senior engineers, they stood to lose their faces and their reputation by speaking up. Whether that would actually happen or not doesn't matter. It was their fear. It's the fear of it happening that was driving their decision-making process. So in the end, the decision was left up to chance, which as a leader wasn't something I wanted to let happen. So how do you break out of a Nash equilibrium like that? There are really only two ways, and both of them tend to fall on the boss or someone with a certain level of authority to execute. The first one is you change the rules of the game for the entire group. You force everyone to adopt a different approach in their decision-making. So in our case, we wanted to make people feel comfortable speaking up when they had concerns. And we also wanted to avoid leaving people under the false assumption that their proposals were well received, just through thumbs up emojis. Or the second option, you rock the boat by calling out what's happening, or by voicing your opinions in a way that sets an example for other people to chime in. That's easier to do as the boss, but doesn't come without risks through the power differential, where your opinion as the boss outshines and outweighs those of the people working for you. So in our example, I wrote up my concerns, which just happened to have a lot of overlap with the concerns I heard from my two senior engineers. I rocked the boat effectively, and I dissented with the proposal. And I changed the rules of the feedback game, discouraging the use of emojis as valid feedback responses. Instead, we required folks to write up and share their thoughts, and required a minimum number of feedbacks on any given proposal, nudging authors to seek out feedback, especially from folks who may dissent. Once you start seeing and understanding a Nash equilibrium, it keeps popping up everywhere. It's a really useful framework, a mental model, to identify dysfunctions in groups that seem stuck in vicious cycles. Take recurring meetings, for example. We already had that example earlier. They tend to take on a life of their own and keep on happening, whether they actually serve any purpose or not. And people keep showing up because the meeting's on the calendar and everybody else is showing up too. Nobody questions their existence. Nobody wants to rock the boat. To break out of them, you could either ask the group whether they still find the meeting valuable, or you put a limit on recurring meetings from the get-go. For example, having them only run for 2 or 3 months, just like David Thomas already mentioned earlier. After that, renewing the meeting is a conscious decision made by the group. The Nash equilibrium is one in a sea of frameworks that I've found useful. Even what I'm showing here is only a small selection. A useful one, but small. It's a starting point for you to build up your own little library. Also, these 3 books, they're great mental models. I highly recommend as a starting point to learn more about what's out there. They contain frameworks for many different disciplines. There are even more book recommendations in the talk materials linked down here and also at the end, if you're wanting to read up more on decision making and mental models. A word of caution though. First off, the Nash equilibrium tends to involve math to determine whether an equilibrium exists. It comes from game theory and economics after all. I don't use the math part of it. To me, it's a useful mental model, a framework, to look at group dynamics and trying to figure out how the group can be broken out of an unhealthy cycle. And second, most frameworks are incomplete, abstracting away pieces of reality or simplifying reality. That is the point of a framework, but it's also why you got to be careful in using and applying them. Frameworks tend to imply simple answers, but humans are complex and complicated. Proceed with caution and reflect on whether your use of a specific framework turned out to be useful in finding a solution or making a decision. Now that we've explored the well-known and widely used frameworks, let's try to build one of our own. You're probably familiar with this little framework, the Eisenhower matrix. It's a widely known, proven tool to categorize the different types of work coming across your desk and try figuring out what to do with them. As many frameworks are, it's short and to the point, leaving a lot of room for interpretation. One part I've been particularly curious about is the little corner here of work that you delegate. The corner seemed incomplete to me. I never really knew what to do with it. Many times I've been approached by folks from my team with questions, i.e. work items, that I was certain I was the wrong person to answer. Either they should have been able to come up with an answer for themselves, or they should have gone to someone else. I wouldn't have to be the one delegating. They could have just found that link on their own, ideally. Initially, my response to them was, "What do you think we should do?" I reflected their own question back to them. Also, I have a rather frustrating trait of coaches. This is a double-edged sword, as it turns out, because not everyone is capable of answering each question. Maybe they're lacking the experience, maybe they're lacking the confidence, or even the authority. Once again, it was up to chance whether any person coming to me with a question or problem might get an answer or not. So I needed an approach that took those complications into account. And so I built my own framework. And here's how that process works. I gathered requirements, as one does. And I wanted my delegation framework to solve several issues. One, as much as possible, I wanted people to find the answers on their own. Second, I wanted to ensure that problems outside of their realm would still be addressed. For example, a question that touches on organization or department-wide issues likely would fall on my shoulders to resolve or to find the right person to resolve it. And third, I wanted to have a clear path to a resolution where I could be sure the problem would be resolved and the person found their answer. Then I went on to create the guiding principles for my framework. Some of these may look familiar to you because they represent my own guiding principles, which just flow nicely into how I build this framework. Guiding principles or values don't just help you make decisions, they also help you building the frameworks to make decisions. And so the work was now just to turn this into a number of steps that I could just walk through every time someone came to me with a problem or a question. And here's what that framework looks like when put together. First of all, I'm asking myself, why did they come to me? Was there something missing? Is there lack of documentation? Is a process unclear? Is a set of responsibilities unclear for them or someone else? So if that is the case, one of my follow-up tasks for this is to bring that kind of clarity. Clarify the process, update documentation, assuming people read it, but at least I can point them to it, or update a set of responsibilities. The next question I ask myself is, am I even the right person to help them? And this is where I get to, do they have the experience or the authority, the experience and confidence to do this kind of work? Maybe they don't. And if they don't, then I might be the right person for them to come to. But I can still figure out how to turn this around and make sure that never happens again. So I could provide them with coaching or mentoring, for example, to give them the experience or the confidence to do that kind of work. Or, when all else fails, and there are plenty of reasons why I do the work myself. Not ideal because I wanted to delegate it in the first place, but it is an option. And if I'm not the right person to help them, who is? I could just look at the org chart and try to figure that out. And then I point them to that person. And as a follow-on steps, maybe within a reasonable period of time, I follow up with that person to make sure that they actually found their answer and that their problem was resolved. And this is what the framework looks like as a flowchart. Personally, I prefer the list of steps. It comes more natural to me as a former engineer, but, if this is your preferred way to visualize these things, you do you. It's all good. Frameworks also work well in truly difficult and dire situations. At one point, I was part of a leadership team that faced a bank account that was emptying out fast. We had to ask our investors to provide us with a bridge round. We knew they wouldn't be thrilled and likely would prefer a different path. For example, finding a new lead investor that they would then co-invest with. The chances at that point generally weren't in our favor. So we started planning ahead for all scenarios we might encounter along the way. Should the cash not materialize, we knew we had to lay off folks as the immediate next step. Discussions around these scenarios took place weeks ahead of when anything would happen. We even explored more outrageous scenarios, at least probably from the investor perspective, like shutting down the company completely, which was a fun thing to explore, I will be honest, or reducing it down to the minimum number of staff and to reboot the business from the ground up. This process gave us a clear map of options we had and clarity on what would happen when each of them would fall away. We just had to follow the arrows. We didn't have to worry about making these decisions in the moment anymore. Instead, we could focus on the circumstances that we control. Ahead of time, it was a lot easier to go through all of these scenarios. In the moment, we would have had to scramble, and we'd have been distracted by all of the emotions that come up when you have to make decisions like that. So instead, we had this map. We felt in control and a certain sense of calm that we would just work through this graph. So I would like to leave you with a few guiding principles that we can distill from this talk. First off, don't leave things up to chance. One of the hooks through this entire talk. I personally hate surprises. This is one of the things I like to pay attention to, not leaving things up to chance. Avoid superstitions. Don't do reorgs just for the sake of reorgs. Listen to the laws of nature. Build your own guiding principles for yourself or your team. And scale yourself and then your team with these frameworks. And maybe you've noticed this throughout the talk, but we kept building up from frameworks on the individual level, then making them work with teams, then in leadership, then in management, and then on the organizational level. Beauty of frameworks is that they work at every single one of these, making decision-making more consistent and transparent and just calmer. What I want to leave you with today is that frameworks are a superpower. That can be your superpower. Having a solid collection and knowledge of them around can help you be more relaxed and more confident as a leader, leaving you more time, focus, and most important, energy for other things. It certainly did that for me. And when interviewing senior leaders for jobs today, I like to ask them what frameworks they use in difficult situations, because I want to know they're able to scale themselves and their teams and make decisions calmly and deliberately and with high quality. Because with superstitions, humans have left things up to chance for thousands of years, 4,000 years. It's still being used today somewhere. As leaders, we don't have that kind of luxury anymore. At this point in our careers and in business, we're not evaluated by the quantity of our decisions, but by their quality and speed. And this is where I will leave you. Thank you.